all you need to know about compression and dynamics processing. All right, so diving in, I feel like an overabundance of information online about this topic has just made it way more complicated than it really needs to be. I'm gonna try to just fucking cut through all that bullshit and give you a fucking practical guide and just basically lay out what you need to know. It's really about the concepts and experimentation so that you can just do your own formulas and don't worry about what other people are doing. Not even what I'm doing. It doesn't fucking matter. Just learn how these fucking things work, which I'm about to show you, and the rest of it will be fucking easy. No problem. Cool. All right, so any audio recording is going to have a certain amount of dynamic range. This just means the difference between quiet and loud parts. That's it. A signal with a wide or high dynamic range would be something like classical music where the quiet parts are really quiet and the loud parts are really loud. Death metal would be like the opposite because it's just like all loud all the fucking time because fucking why not? Another example of a recording with a high dynamic range would be something like a recording of a human voice going from like a whisper to a scream. The whisper is going to be quite a bit quieter than the scream. Too much dynamic range can be a problem if we're trying to balance different elements in a mix because it's kind of like trying to hit a moving target. The perfect volume for one part of a recording might not be the same as another part of the recording because maybe, for example, the vocal went from a whisper to a scream. If you have the fader balance set to have the whisper in balance with the rest of the music, then that scream is going to be way too loud. So then you need to bring the volume back down. But then now those whispers are too quiet, so you see the fucking problem. If we can compress that dynamic range and make them all closer to a similar volume, then suddenly we can bring all of that up and be in a more beneficial ballpark. I don't know how to fucking... This is why I need a script. Whatever, dude. So basically, we need something that can kind of control the volume depending on what's happening in the vocal, if it's a whisper or a scream, or anywhere in between. A lot of these volume changes happen in the span of milliseconds, so we're not really automating that shit. That's not happening. Basically, what we need is like a robot that's just got a hand on the fader, and they're just watching the input level, and they're just adjusting the output level based on what's coming in, just to keep everything consistent. If only we had something, maybe AI or something could handle that. AI's been doing a lot of cool shit, right? Well, actually, we don't need fucking AI because analog shit's been doing this for like 50 years already, and it's called a compressor. And basically all these fancy plugins are just emulating analog circuitry. Suck it, AI. This is basically all that a compressor is basically like a hand on a volume fader that pulls that volume fader down by a specific amount at a specific speed once the input level crosses a specific threshold. That's it. Deep, 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 deep. That's it. There are tons of different types of compressors, and people will talk about how different ones are better on different sources and everything, but I would ignore all of that until you have mastered compression itself. And it doesn't matter what compressor you are using, as long as it's like intuitive to you and everything makes sense. That's basically what I'm trying to help with this video. Don't worry about different compressor types or learning specific ratios or formulas because none of that really matters unless you can effectively control the dynamic range of a signal by ear. And to do that, you can use any compressor. It doesn't really matter which one you're using. Here's what you need to know. Compression is flexible and stretchy like a rubber band. I like to think of it like I'm pushing sounds into it. You've got your threshold, and then the volume of this input signal kind of pushes into it. It can kind of create a feeling of movement based on how it reacts to sounds. It can help things sound thicker or punchier, and it generally has the most character out of all of the dynamics processing tools. The only thing you need to know at first is that compression is just pulling the volume of the loud parts down, and that's it. All the other shit is just detail and like flavors of it. If you're still learning, I would just focus on the concept of the automatic gain reduction. Different compressors will have different types of controls, but they all generally operate the same way. The threshold sets the threshold for action. So that's like the main thing you want to keep in mind is there's a threshold where the compressor starts doing something. Before that, nothing happens. So if you've got a signal that's kind of bouncing around below the threshold, the compressor is not going to do anything. It's once the signal crosses that threshold, then it's going to start dipping. Some compressors, you can control the threshold and bring it down to wherever the signal is. Like say here's your signal bouncing around here. You can bring the threshold down to kind of control when the compressor starts operating. In other compressors, the threshold is set, so you have to adjust this input level to start hitting that. Generally, you keep this threshold at the point where you want your robot fader hand guy to start pulling that fader down. I like to think of compression as I'm pushing against the threshold, whatever it's set. Whether it's a preset threshold or if it's adjustable, that's what I'm basically pushing up against, however I'm doing that, whether that's input level or adjusting the threshold. The further you push the signal into the threshold, the more compressive it will become. The ratio control tells the compressor how far down to pull that volume fader. Don't even worry about numbers when it comes to ratio. These are just to like help you memorize settings or communicate settings to other people. All you really need to know is that the lower the ratio, the less compression and movement, more gentle, and then as you increase, it's just going to make those volume adjustments more drastic. It's going to pull the fader down further. The attack and release controls just basically control how quickly the compressor reacts. So how quickly it pulls the volume down and how quickly it returns the volume back to normal. There's a common misconception where people will think that the compressor waits for a specific amount of time before it starts doing it. It starts immediately, it's a different speed. So, makeup gain or the output control of a compressor is basically just there to make up for the loss of volume that it was brought on by the compression process. You have to remember that compression is dropping the volume. So by definition, we're making the signal quieter, and that makeup gain is just to bring that back up. So that's why, there's kind of a myth that compression makes things louder. It doesn't. It just makes it so that you can make it louder afterwards. By bringing the loud parts down, you'll be able to make the quieter parts louder. And it just makes it seem like, oh, wow, I just increased the volume, but that's the makeup gain. The knee control on a compressor is basically just the kind of like the softness or like the strictness of the threshold setting. So a soft knee is going to basically allow the signal to start being pulled down, or the volume to start being pulled down as the input signal approaches the threshold. So you'll see it like as a curve, like in a lot of compressors that have like a graphical representation of the knee. It's a little bit more subtle compression because instead of waiting for the signal to reach the threshold and then immediately start acting, it's kind of anticipating like, oh, here it comes. I better start pulling down my volume. So you can kind of think of a knee control kind of like a transparency or like subtlety control. If you want your compression to be a little bit less obvious, you can use a softer knee. Yeah, this video is getting way too long, so I'm breaking it into multiple pieces. So if you want to check out those other tools, click somewhere on the screen for part 2 of this video. Otherwise, just continue on with your day. Have a good one. See ya.